I guess John is not here. In fact, I am now John, in case people haven't noticed that. So, I think really the only other thing that I have is like the birds that have been seen recently. And Terry Mitchell had a black-billed cuckoo and a bay-breasted warbler out at Oxley on Sunday. When we did the big day count, we had a long-billed curlew out at Lake Yohola.
Cool.
We've had Western grebe was also reported out at Lake Yohola on the 4th. And what else lately? A black-chinned hummingbird was at a residence in Broken Arrow. Someone still reported a red-breasted nuthatch on the 6th at a private residence. And a couple of warming warblers, one on 5-3, and then out at Oxley Nature Center, and also a golden wing warbler was seen out at Oxley Nature Center by Peterson. So, but bay-breasted warbler has been reported several different times throughout the last week or two out at Oxley. So, and like I was saying, I think our garden tour went pretty well this past weekend. The weather didn't rain. It sprinkled a little bit on Sunday, so we had a lot of people out, and I think the plant vendors all did well. So,
sounds like a rousing success.
Yep. So I did hear a complaint once or twice about, parking and having to walk, and the fact that some of the vendors had sold out of some stuff, but oh well, I can't control everything. So I'm just happy the weather worked out. We didn't have any tornadoes or high winds like we did 2 years ago. So
Well,
I think
those are
Jay.
the points of success.
Yep. So Jay, does anyone else have anything that they want to talk about real quick? We'll have Jay introduce our speaker. This is going to be our last meeting until September. So September, we're hoping to be back down at the Garden Center. We're leaning that way, though we still have not made a final decision. So you can just watch our email and our Facebook page. But in September, it's going to be Jay doing his program on India that we were unsuccessful in getting done last month. So, okay, Jay, do you want to go?
Yeah, you bet. It's really my pleasure to introduce Josef Lindholm, who is the curator of birds for the Tulsa Zoo. And he has been in that position for about 10 years now.
Yes.
Before then, he has worked with the Fort Worth Zoo, Disney's Animal Kingdom, the Cameron Park Zoo in Waco, and most recently the Dallas World Aquarium, where he was chief aviculturist. He's published a number of articles and written several chapters in books, primarily on the history of birds in zoos and private collections. And tonight he's going to share a little bit of his expertise in that, and talking about North American songbirds as they relate to birds that have been in captivity in the past. And I'm eager to see what kind of information Joseph's going to show us. And some of those birds that we see in our backyard and take for granted every day, not necessarily has been the case. In the past, you had to have them in a cage in your house to see them. So, Josef, tell us what it's all about.
Well, the text that I had underneath has disappeared, but I do have things to read when I need to. But at any rate, I thought that especially people who have spent a great deal of their time enjoying our North American native migratory birds and songbirds might be interested in seeing a somewhat different perspective from a different time and place. And let's see. Okay, I'm going to go back to, let's see, this is going, here we go. Back. Yes, a very different time and place. This is 1764, the palace at Versailles, the court of a sun king, Louis XIV, Louis XIV, who, if he was going to do anything at all, did it on a grand fashion. And here we see him welcoming back his disgraced cousin, Le Grand Condé, one of the great military figures at the time. He was a hero of the 30 Years' War, but then after that, he tried to overthrow the king. But then after that, he beat the Dutch, so he was restored to favor and lived the rest of his life in peace with his birds out in his country estate, Chantilly, or Chantilly, as the Big Bopper would say. His Most Serene Highness, at any rate, was one of the most ferocious warriors. In one of his Dutch battles, he had 3 horses shot out from under him. But among other things, we have some correspondence that he had with a French priest, a priest in Paris, who was his agent for buying rare birds. And the priest sent him a letter in 1682. The bird seller, having notified me that he had an extraordinary bird freshly arrived from the Indies, I went to see it, and I found it as rare in its figure as in its plumage. It is a little larger than a big lark. It is all fire-colored, with a crest on its head and a large reddish bill, too. Well made and steady on its feet, very cheerful, very lively, and eating well. It has, says the bird seller, a warbling song like a nightingale's, but I did not hear it. Though I did hear an occasional whistle, which was very pretty and gracious, and if one were assured that it would live a long time, it should not be passed up. It is true that it seems healthy and eats well of a certain seed, canary grass, which it likes very much. If your Most Serene Highness would like it, I will make the trip, pay for it, and send it to you. As it happened, this purchase became a protracted affair. In a subsequent letter to the prince, the abbé wrote that he had managed to convince the seller to reduce the price to 10 louis, which was the better part of a year's wages for an artisan, or a price of 5 writing desks. The abbé promptly purchased this bird, since an agent of His Majesty the King appeared ready to offer 12 louis. I imagine you probably have all guessed what sort of bird this was. Up here in the corner, we see a pair of them from 1690. This is in the collection of the Dutch king, William III of Holland, who the Grand Condé had defeated in battle. He had a favorite court artist, Melchior Dondecourter, who spent a lot of time painting the animals in the Royal Dutch Menagerie. And we can see cardinals taking their place with an ornate lorikeet from the island of Sulawesi in Indonesia, an African gray parrot, a lesser sulfur-crested cockatoo from Indonesia, and blue-crowned hanging parrots from Malaysia, and these little squirrel monkeys that the Dutch had brought from Suriname, and their Madagascar lovebirds, and a Moluccan purple-naped lory, and an Alexandrine parakeet from the Himalayas. And so at any rate, a treasured part of the Royal Dutch Menagerie. And back in the late 1600s, as we saw, a better part of a year's wages for an artisan. That painting the previous painting was done by Melchior Dondecourter, who was succeeded in popularity by a Hungarian, Jacob Bogdani, who ended up living in England and painting the birds in the royal menagerie of William III, who had also become King of England through marriage. William and Mary College is named after him, and also the birds in the collection of Queen Anne. And again, we see a cardinal in the middle of a collection of all sorts of other things, a blue and gold macaw and a European shelduck and a Felvis tree duck that appeared to have produced ducklings in captivity back in the sometime before 1724. And there's one of the big old world purple gallinules. But so again, we have a cardinal occupying pride of place among all these rare birds. And here's another one along with a painted bunting in another painting by Bogdani, again, probably of birds in England. Here's another Bogdani painting. And here we not only have a cardinal and a painted bunting, but we also have an indigo bunting, which back in the 1700s were called blue popes, and they were very popular. There were French bird dealers back before the French Revolution who specialized in importing blue popes from Louisiana, which of course was still part of France at the time. And this is a Moluccan cockatoo, which has always been a very popular cage bird. So already by the early 1700s, there was a great deal of interest in the birds of the eastern United States through the French in Louisiana and the Dutch with their territories, and pretty soon with the people in Virginia as the British started expanding their colonies. Closer look at the painted bunting and the indigo bunting and the cardinal. And these two little birds are Indian strawberry finches, which are still very popular cage birds. And lovebirds, of course, are still very popular, and ringneck parakeets. But not all the interest in birds was in the 18th century was confined to Europe. Over here on our side, there was a great deal of interest in our own native songbirds as cage birds. If you visited the governor's palace in colonial Williamsburg, you would have seen dozens of cages of cardinals hung around as ornamentation. This gentleman probably had a cardinal that lived for 21 years. At least he had a stuffed one in this incredible collection of birds here that he said had lived 21 years, and it probably belonged to him. This is Charles Wilson Peel, who was a Revolutionary War hero and a very good friend of Washington and Franklin and Jefferson. He painted Washington 3 times, and he was also the first American paleontologist. You can see he is very proud of his mastodon skeleton, which he dug up in Pennsylvania. It's the first mounted North American fossil mammal. And you can also see he's got, let's see my arrow, here's my arrow, okay. You can see he's got a jaw and bones of more mastodons down here. That mastodon skeleton is now in Germany at the museum in Darmstadt. And he's also, he was one of the premier taxidermists. You can see he's got a turkey that he is still a work in progress. But at any rate, with all of his stuffed penguins and many other things, it was one of a huge collection of birds in the world at the time. And a few of them still exist. You can see these at Harvard. They belong to George Washington. Lafayette, Washington's comrade in arms, sent these to him from the royal menagerie of Louis XVI in Paris. He got 7 pheasants. They didn't live long, but Charles Wilson Peel made mounts of them, and these are now one of the treasures at the Harvard Museum of Comparative Zoology. Another bird that Charles Wilson Peel preserved belonged to Thomas Jefferson and came to the White House from none other than the Lewis and Clark expedition. That magpie had been collected rather early on in the Lewis and Clark expedition, just before they actually plunged out into the unknown wilderness. At that point, they were still in the Mandan territory on the Missouri River, and on the 7th of April, 1805, in present-day North Dakota. That was their last outpost of civilization, and then they went west and were not heard from for a long time, but we know the rest of the story of Lewis and Clark and how well they did and what happened as a result of that. But at any rate, before they plunged into the unknown wilderness in 1805, they sent a few things back to Washington. And when these packages arrived at the White House, Thomas Jefferson's French butler was responsible for unpacking them. And so he wrote a letter to Jefferson, who happened to be at Monticello. So Etienne Lemaire, who was one of the first French experts on wine and fine food in America, Jefferson, of course, was very fond of those things. And so at any rate, Jefferson's French butler writes a letter to his boss in Monticello. This is to inform you that I have just received by Baltimore a barrel and 4 boxes and a kind of cage in which there is a little animal very much resembling the squirrel, and in the other a bird resembling the magpie of Europe. Jefferson replied on the 17th of August of 1805, be so good as to have particular care taken of a squirrel and magpie, which came with the things from Baltimore, that I may see them alive at my return. And his butler, Lemaire, wrote again on the 20th of August, the magpie and the kind of squirrel are very well. They're in the room where Monsieur receives his callers, which would have been the uncompleted East Room of the White House. And but after a while, Jefferson realized he mustn't be greedy to keep the only prairie dog and North American magpie west of the Mississippi. So he sent them on to Philadelphia to his friend Charles Wilson Peel, who wrote on the 22nd of October, 1805, I'm surprised to see the magpie so correctly like that of Europe, for I've always found some differences in the birds which have been described and belonging to both continents. It is interesting to get the living one in good condition for a better comparison, and also to give it a place near one I have from Great Britain, handsomely mounted. And early in November, Peel wrote, the magpie is in good health. It may be well to inquire whether this breed of the magpie was not originally from Europe. As it happens, the American black-billed magpie was not given a formal scientific description until 1823, following a British naturalist's travels in the West, and that's when they first figured there was some difference between an American magpie and the magpies that are so common in Europe. But at any rate, no one had known there were North American magpies until the Lewis and Clark expedition, or at least no one in the scientific community. But at any rate, this bird in Alexander Wilson's painting actually was the original Jefferson magpie, because after it died, of course, Charles Wilson Peel added it to his collection of stuffed birds, and Alexander Wilson painted that particular specimen and included it in his books on North American birds, which, however, were rather quickly superseded by somebody else's books and paintings on North American birds, namely the person after whom your society is named, John James Audubon, who, of course, produced a far more expansive work and was a much better artist. These brown thrashers, which Audubon shows in typical drama, were species that actually were being bred in captivity by one of Audubon's friends, who was also eventually his father-in-law, the Reverend Bachman in South Carolina. John Bachman, of course, is known for the Bachman's warbler, which, alas, is no longer with us. But he had a remarkable collection of aviaries. Bachman and his friend Wilson, Dr. Wilson, both in Charleston, they had remarkable aviaries, and Audubon, what a lot of people don't realize that with all of Audubon's colored plates, there was also a very extensive text that he wrote with it, the ornithological biographies, which are a wonderful read. Audubon wrote as magnificently as he painted, but at any rate, his friend, the Reverend Bachman, not only bred brown thrashers, which is a surprising thing to do back before the back in the 1830s or earlier. He also bred painted buntings. Bachman wrote, "I have kept these birds for many years in aviaries, the males and females of a year old who are of a uniform color, but I've invariably found them to assume their perfect plumage in the second year. This bird could be easily domesticated and multiplied in Europe in the manner of a canary. I have had them raise 3 broods of young in the year in confinement. The plumage, however, in this state was never so brilliant as when wild, and it's always been a problem. You don't see painted buntings in zoos that much because they don't retain their colors very well. They still are attractive, but they fade out pretty badly. So what was a problem then is still a problem now. But at any rate, in South Carolina, Bachman and his friend, Dr. Charles Wilson, were breeding all sorts of things. Ground doves, cardinals, blue grosbeaks, white-throated sparrows, towhees, bob whites, and wood ducks were all breeding in their aviaries. Here's another very typically vigorous Audubon painting. I'm sure a lot of people laughed when they saw this blue jay with that egg, but at any rate, Audubon tried bringing a whole bunch of blue jays to England. While at Louisville in Kentucky in the winter of 1830, I purchased 25 of these birds at the rate of 61 cents each. What's kind of startling about that is when he bought 350 passenger pigeons in New York and took those alive to England, they cost him 4 cents each back in the 1830s. But so in 1830, he paid 61 cents each for 25 blue jays, which was a pretty hefty sum. And I shipped those to New Orleans and afterwards to Liverpool with a view of turning them out in the English woods. They were caught in common traps baited with maize and were brought to me one after another as soon as secured. And placing them in the large cage which I had ordered for the purpose of sending abroad, I was surprised to see how cowardly each new bird was when introduced to his brethren, who on being in the cage a day or two were as gay and frolicsome as if at liberty in the woods. The newcomer, on the contrary, would run into a corner, place his head almost in a perpendicular position, and remain silent and sulky, with an appearance of stupidity quite foreign to his nature. He would suffer all the rest to walk over him and trample him down without ever changing his position. If corn was presented to him or even placed close to his bill, he would not so much as look at it. If touched with the hand, he would cower, lie down on his side, and remain motionless. The next day, however, things were altered. He was again a jay, taking up corn, placing it between his feet, hammering it with his bill, splitting the grain, picking out the kernel, and dropping the divided husks. When the cage was filled, it was amusing to listen to their hammering, all mounted on their perch side by side, each pecking at a grain of maize like so many blacksmiths paid by the piece. They drank a great deal, ate broken pecan nuts, grapes, dried fruits of all sorts, and especially fresh beef, of which they were extremely fond, roosted very peaceably close together, and were very pleasing pets. They bore the passage to Europe pretty well, and most of them reached Liverpool in good health, but a few days after their arrival, a disease occasioned by insects adhering to every part of their body made such progress that some died every day. Many remedies were tried in vain, and only one individual reached London. The insects had so multiplied on it that I immersed it in an infusion of tobacco, which, however, killed it in a few hours. Bird mites are not something that nowadays we know much more about keeping birds well, so we don't have the mite problems that poor Audubon did. But at any rate, I strongly recommend Audubon's ornithological biographies because he, as I said, was just as wonderful a writer as he was a painter. Going forward a few years, past the Industrial Revolution and into the high Victorian era of prosperity, in the 1870s, all the little kingdoms in Germany united into the German Empire, which became very popular and very wealthy and very trendy. And one of the trendy things was having as many possible birds inside your aviary, which was usually a room in your house. This apparently is an actual depiction of all the birds that Karl Roos, who was an authority on cage birds, kept in one indoor aviary in his house. He rented, and they say his landlords were not terribly happy. But in the middle of all these, there's a California quail and now extinct Australian paradise parakeet and some hanging parrots and a strawberry finch and some lovebirds and zebra finches, which are still very popular cage birds, and there's a Cape dove flying next to them, and an Australian diamond sparrow and white Java sparrows. In the middle of all that, here's an eastern bluebird, which was already bred at London Zoo in the 1860s and was quite a popular cage bird back then. Lots of bluebirds were imported to England and Europe in the Victorian era. Closer picture of that bluebird. And public zoos were flourishing as well. From 1869 to 1910, there was a place in Berlin that was called the Berlin Aquarium, and people going there are just as surprised as people who go to the Dallas World Aquarium in downtown Dallas to see that a major portion of a collection are birds kept in huge cages all over the place. Dr. Brehm he figured out how to take piano wire, and since of course the Germans made the best pianos, he had plenty of piano wire, and so he strung it up and down between this framework and was able to keep all sorts of birds in these big indoor aviaries in the upper part of his aquarium, which eventually was closed after he died in 1910 because the real estate in Berlin became so valuable that it was more profitable to tear all that down and build fancy houses instead. There's down at the lower part of the picture was where they kept the fishes in tanks, and the upper part was where the birds lived, as well as one of the first gorillas in Europe. Brehm was sort of the Marlin Perkins of his time. He was a very popular author. He wrote an encyclopedia of animals, and he was offered the position of director of the Cincinnati Zoo. Cincinnati, Ohio had a lot of German businessmen who had done very well there, so they decided if they were going to build a zoo, they would have a proper German zoo with a proper German zoo director. But unfortunately, Dr. Brehm's wife and kids got sick and died about that time, and that, among other things, prevented him from going to live in America. But the people in Cincinnati were being very busy introducing all the European songbirds they could to the Ohio Valley, things like bullfinches and goldfinches and blackbirds and nightingales and European robins and European water ouzels of all things, and all sorts of European birds. About the only thing that the foreign birds they still have there now are starlings and sparrows, despite the huge amount of money these German immigrants spent trying to introduce European birds to Cincinnati. But at any rate, after they gave up on that, then they decided to build a zoo. Originally, they were going to build this birdhouse, but it ended up becoming a primate house. And now it's the reptile house at Cincinnati, and it's still there, and it's one of the oldest zoo buildings in the United States. Instead, they built this series of Chinese buildings with cages between them, all interconnected, and had quite a collection of birds in there. That was the first place where the blue jay was bred in captivity. And it's also the place where the last Carolina parakeet and the last passenger pigeon died. One of these buildings still stand, and you can see us stuffed Carolina parakeets and passenger pigeons inside it. It's now a monument to extinct animals. But in the meantime, of course, the New Yorkers were not going to let the folks in Cincinnati have the fanciest birdhouse. The Bronx Zoo was started, well, of course, the New York Zoological Society was started in 1899, and not only ran the Bronx Zoo and the New York Aquarium, but very quickly became one of the leading conservation societies in the world. One of the most famous people was William Beebe. You see him here about to climb inside this bathysphere and go thousands of feet into the depths off Bermuda to observe deep sea fish. Beebe is mostly famous for that. He lived, as you saw, he obviously survived that and lived a long time, but he actually was the Bronx Zoo's first curator of birds and one of the leading people in both breeding birds in captivity and promoting bird conservation in the United States. After the passenger pigeon and Carolina parakeet had gone extinct, the Bronx Zoo bred a lot of herring gulls because they thought those were going to go extinct, because at the time gull eggs were a very popular ingredient in cakes, and the people who would collect gull eggs would row out to the rookeries, smash all the eggs, and then come back a few days later and collect all the nice freshly laid eggs, so then people wouldn't have the unpleasant experience of cracking an egg into a cake and having an embryo fall out of it. So they would destroy 2 sets of gull eggs, and gull populations of all sorts, ringbills and herring gulls, plummeted all over the United States at the end of the 19th century. And so the Bronx Zoo is actually breeding herring gulls as an endangered species project, along with mourning doves, which they thought were going to join the passenger pigeon pretty soon. William Beebe spent a night up in the torch of a Statue of Liberty with this man, Madison Grant, also one of the leading conservationists in the United States. They were up in the torch of the Statue of Liberty to see if it was really killing as many migratory birds as night as they were told, and they found indeed it was. They collected dead birds from the base of the statue and submitted their observations, and the result was that the torch of a Statue of Liberty was dimmed. And this has a very ironic appropriateness to us, because Madison Grant nowadays, despite being one of the great conservationists ever, he is basically now he who shall not be named, because he was also one of the most outspoken scientific racists and eugenicists and anti-immigration people. And he wrote a very influential book about how America's precious Nordic genes were being swamped by all these people from Europe and Poland and other parts of Eastern Europe, and ended up getting immigration laws passed in 1924, which prevented Jewish people from immigrating to America during the Nazi period, and also started a war with Japan in a way, because the Japanese were very insulted that the quota of Japanese immigrants was reduced to 0. But at any rate, one of the leading anti-immigration proponents at the time. So we don't think much about all the work that he did to preserve North America's birds and mammals, but instead he's regarded as a very wicked person, which he was. Also very heroic, kind of one of the odd paradoxes of American history. But at any rate, he started the New York Zoological Society, was the president, and he ran it up till he died in 1937, They say his last words in his hospital bed were asking if the zoo still had its prohibition against allowing people to take their own photos in the zoo. But at any rate, along with Madison Grant, William Temple Hornaday was the other leading New York Zoological Society conservationist. And he's much better remembered, although there has been some controversy recently because Hornaday and Grant got in lots of trouble for exhibiting, so people said, exhibiting an African pygmy in the ape house at the Bronx Zoo. Hornaday always insisted he was kind of a student keeper and had come there with a collection of chimpanzees and wasn't being kept in the cage except when he was there working with them, but it created a huge fuss. And people remember that now. But Hornaday is still remembered, especially for reintroducing the bison to Yellowstone and other places. And so one of the pioneering people to reintroduce endangered animals to their original habitat. So saving the bison is something Hornaday is still remembered for. And also he was one of the leading people for bird preservation. He fought tirelessly against people wearing egret feathers in their hats or whole stuffed birds, or people using stuffed birds as ornaments, or people eating quail and canvasbacks and grouse in restaurants. He ended the practice of being able to sell game birds in grocery stores. And he also was one of the leading people to end the practice of keeping cage birds. So North American songbirds became illegal in New York in 1890. It became illegal to sell songbirds in pet stores in New York City. Very soon after that was Chicago. By 1904, the state of Louisiana and the city of New Orleans stopped the songbird trade. And New Orleans had been the leading depot for painted buntings and indigo buntings, which were a huge business being imported by a German animal dealing firm all over Europe. And this German company, Rua, actually had its offices in New Orleans as well as New York. They imported canaries to New York and exported buntings out of Louisiana. But all of that ended in Louisiana in 1904. And by 1906, all across the United States, it became illegal to sell cage birds in pet stores or to export them out of the country for commercial purposes, or to trap them to sell. For years, there were people who kept cage birds privately, as we will see, but that was because they were considered amateur ornithologists and were able to get special permits fairly easy in those days, as long as they didn't buy or sell anything. After William Beebe, who we saw in his diving bell, he kind of lost his job at the Bronx Zoo, and he enraged Hornaday by being sent on a 2-year expedition to Asia to study pheasants by the person who owned the New Jersey Electric Company and was one of the first big aviary owners. And of course, Beebe kept working for the New York Zoological Society as an explorer and researcher, but he didn't run the bird department anymore. That went to his right-hand man, Lee Crandall, who lived till 1969. And here's a picture of him on an expedition collecting birds of paradise in New Guinea. But Crandall and Beebe, back in 1909, they prepared the first list of birds that had been bred in captivity in the United States. And Crandall kept publishing these lists into the 1930s. They're an invaluable resource to see who was doing what. It's interesting, back in 1909, you can see that Colonel Kuser, who was the rich New Jersey electric company executive who sent Beebe off to the Himalayas to study pheasants, in his private aviaries, he was the first person to breed the catbird. And American robins were bred at the Bronx Zoo, and wood thrushes. And white-breasted nuthatches were bred by a private aviculturist. Rose-breasted grosbeaks were bred at the Bronx Zoo, and song sparrows were bred by the same person who bred the white-breasted nuthatch. So back in 1909, after it was illegal to commercially deal with native songbirds, you still had specialized wealthy collectors who had permits to keep and breed them and study them. This painting was done in 1912 for an English magazine, the Avicultural Magazine, which commissioned gorgeous paintings by very well-known bird painters. Goodchild is one of the best. And in 1912, since they couldn't get their painted buntings from Louisiana anymore, they were importing them from Mexico. So before the First World War, there was still a big business in Mexican painted buntings. And of course, in Mexico, they kept trapping painted buntings until quite recently. I remember about 1984 on the street in Tijuana, watching a man dressed like Elvis who had peroxidized hair and was wearing sort of a white, sparkly Elvis suit. And he had 4 cages of painted buntings strung down his back, and he was walking down the street at the end of the day. And, you know, at that time, I hadn't a camera. Of course, nowadays with cell phones, there's so many things one can take pictures of, but I really wish I had taken a picture of Elvis walking down the streets of Tijuana with 100 painted buntings, all males, in the cages on his back. But so at any rate, the Mexican painted buntings and cardinals kept the European trade going. This bird down here is from Asia. It's a parrot finch, but they were included in the same picture because both of them were called nonpareils in French, without compare, because of their gorgeous combination of green, red, and blue. The Bronx Zoo was started in 1899, and in 1905, they built the state-of-the-art birdhouse then. I think these cages are still there. The rest of this building is now a library and offices for the art department. But these aviaries are still outside, and they, in here, was a big collection of North American songbirds. The sea lion pool is still there at the Bronx too, so they keep their tradition. But they were very proud of this birdhouse when they built it. A lot of cages, 152 cages overall. And this one was quite famous at the time because the English thought it was just awful. They couldn't imagine that one would find anything worthwhile in keeping a whole bunch of songbirds in a cage that big, because what kind of person was going to stand and read all the signs and look at them all? But of course, the people at the Bronx Zoo were way ahead of their time in realizing that folks like birds in big aviaries. But the British made quite a fuss about it in the Avicultural Magazine as what a ridiculous idea to keep birds in something like that. Another view of the Bronx Zoo's big indoor aviary, a bunch of black skimmers and terns down here in the corner. The skimmers actually used to be able to skim in this pool here, but so that was considered a revolutionary cage of its time. And the London Zoo eventually built a birdhouse in the 20s where they had some big cages, but they also built all of these so they could keep many different sorts of small songbirds in small cages where people could really see them. This was how Germans and English people kept small birds in zoos so they could be appreciated. The Berlin Zoo in 1895, they built a magnificent birdhouse, after the old Berlin aquarium that I'd mentioned earlier had been closed down, then the Berlin Zoo that had existed since the 1840s, they built a fantastic aviary. They had some marvelous large cages, but then they also had an enormous number of little tiny cages. And you can see how busy people were kept taking care of all these birds kept in individual cages all day long. They also kept birds in interesting glass boxes, which actually worked fairly well, especially with hummingbirds. This aggressive looking sign says "Go right," and the rather aggressive look of that sign can also be attributable that this picture was taken in the 1930s when the Nazis were in power. And of course, World War II started in 1939, and in 1943, the British had had enough of the Germans bombing them, so they bombed the Germans, and so the Berlin birdhouse was totally destroyed. A lot of the birds are still alive, and I have a document where all sorts of little finches and other things were evacuated to Vienna and France and Poland, kind of sort of a grim humor in with Germans in the middle of World War II evacuating finches and songbirds to occupied France and Poland to the zoos there. In the meantime, in France, Captain Delacour had his place in France destroyed by a German occupation. He was quite a remarkable character. I got to meet him. He loved attending conferences right into his 90s. And he, despite being one of the most well-known ornithologists in the world, he loved talking to people if they were interested in birds. So I got to have several interesting conversations with him when he was very old and looked like Yoda. But he wasn't always very old, and here he was a captain in the French army during during World War II. But before that, in the 1930s, he traveled all over Indochina and Madagascar doing ornithological research and collecting birds. And he made a big trip through the United States where, among other things, and here's one, he was not only an ornithologist who collected dead birds from museums, he also had one of the finest private collections of birds in the world, his place in France at Clare. But in 1936, we see an announcement in the Avicultural magazine that the US Fish and Wildlife and the California Game Department had given him a special permit. And with the help of Mr. Eric Kinsey of San Francisco, he was able to put together this interesting collection of North American passerine birds. So you can see there were pine siskins and lazuli buntings and quite a few Audubon's warblers. And at any rate, I knew someone who actually saw these birds in Oakland before they were sent to Europe. But Eric Kinsey, who assisted Captain Delacour, he was already well known for exporting hummingbirds to Japan, the first ones in Japan, and he did a lot of research on North American native birds and had a wonderful collection in his place in Marin into the 1960s. But so at any rate, Delacour assembled this collection of California songbirds and took them to Europe. And the Western bluebirds, which he brought over in 1936, in 1937, they were bred by one of his friends, Alfred Ezra. Ezra looks like the quintessential old British gentleman, but he was actually born in Calcutta. His brother, who also had a huge animal collection, was the sheriff of Calcutta. And the Ezra family had been advisors to the caliphs and sultans in Baghdad for hundreds of years, an old Jewish family with Iraqi roots. But at any rate, Alfred Ezra had an enormous estate near London and kept a fantastic bird collection. And in 1938, he bred mountain bluebirds at his place. But then 1939, World War II started along, and a lot of Alfred Ezra's estate was dug up to grow potatoes, and he never had as big a bird collection after that. And meantime, Delacour, of course, he'd also kept some mountain bluebirds and western bluebirds. And when the Nazis invaded Delacour's place in Normandy, after Delacour was mobilized with his troops and far away, they left the birds unattended for several days. A lot of small tropical things, the hummingbirds, all starved to death. But apparently, the western and mountain bluebirds survived 3 days without anyone feeding them. And then the Germans decided that it wasn't proper to let all these birds die. So they had the same German company, Ruhe, which used to export painted buntings and indigo buntings out of New Orleans before 1904. The Ruhe company came and boxed up what was left of Delacour's small bird collection. And from what I've heard, Delacour and Dr. Kinsey, who'd assisted him, were both disgusted to hear that the bluebirds ended up in Hitler's private aviaries in Berchtesgaden. So Hitler's private retreat apparently had an aviary, and these California bluebirds collected in 1936 ended up there after 1940. Delacour, in the meantime, once he was demobilized, managed to make it to the United States, and he became somebody very important in the Bronx Zoo administration. Here he is with his friend Crandall in front of the hummingbird exhibit. And Delacour took the 1905 birdhouse and completely redid it. Most of the people who knew Delacour remember him when he was very old and looked like Yoda. So seeing him laugh his head off with one of the Rockefellers over here, and Henry Fairfield Osborne Jr., who was another leading conservationist. At any rate, Delacour did very well from 1940 to 1947, when he then went back to France and recreated his collection that had been pretty much destroyed by the Nazis. He built a special building for keeping hummingbirds in the Bronx Zoo and pioneered these very attractive indoor bird exhibits. And one thing in particular, which he did that relates to our North American songbirds, he took this hole here, which had parrots on one side and pigeons in the other, and completely transformed it. So he turned that hole full of parrot and pigeon exhibits into a series of planted aviaries. We have ones at Tulsa Zoo that are very similar to these today. It's become a style. He originated a style that became very, let's see, I've lost my pointer here, but Delacour's planted aviaries. This one is for desert birds. He had Anna's and black-chinned hummingbirds in this one, but then this one was his Connecticut garden. And he kept wood warblers and various sorts of North American songbirds in here. So this was this New England garden was quite a very attractive way to display wood warblers, which had a long tradition at the Bronx Zoo. When the Bronx Zoo eventually decided to stop keeping North American songbirds in 2012, they sent their last ones to us at Tulsa, and we got a chestnut-sided warbler, along with a barn swallow and a rose-breasted grosbeak and a peewee and other birds, which, however, were quite old when we got them. So unfortunately, we don't have them now. But Bronx went on to, after what Delacour did in the 40s, in the 1960s, the Bronx Zoo went on to pioneer amazing indoor planted exhibits. Down here, this jungle stream, which was mostly for tropical birds, when I first saw it in 1978, there was a North American ovenbird in there, along with the birds from Asia and Africa. And then in 1972, the Bronx opened an absolutely fantastic bird building, which is still there today, the World of Birds. And there was a whole eastern woodland forest, which, as I mentioned, in 2012, they decided to turn into Siberia. So they sent us their North American songbirds in 2012. The Brookfield Zoo in Chicago, that was another place that had a big collection of North American songbirds. And here is a wren tit that the aforementioned Eric Kinsey in California traded to his friend, the curator of birds at the Brookfield Zoo in Chicago, probably for something like lark buntings. The National Zoo in Washington, D.C., of course, the Smithsonian couldn't let Chicago and New York pull ahead of them. So they also built a very nice birdhouse, of which we will see more later. The wife of the director of the Bronx Zoo was very meticulous, and she kept very detailed notes of the birds they had for the first 40 years. So from up until 1928, the first 40 years of a national zoo in Washington, D.C., you can see they had 4 white-throated sparrows and 28 painted buntings. And why or how they got specifically San Diego song sparrows, I have yet to find out, but I hope to eventually. San Diego had originally built a condor cage back in 1936. And in this aviary, they bred condors and bald eagles and ravens and other things. But then John Delacour, who came back from France in the 1950s to direct all the museums in Los Angeles, art history and natural history, he worked closely with San Diego, and he suggested, why don't you put the people inside the cage? And so they did, and turned this into a giant rainforest cage in the 1960s, and kept all these birds in it. There was quite a collection of odd North American things mixed up in here, pine siskins and Bohemian waxwings and cedar waxwings and California brown towies. And eventually the old curator, who was from Tulsa, dear old Casey, at San Diego for 40 years after he left Oklahoma, he told me that was the funnest aviary anyone ever had. We had 1,000 birds in it of 200 species. No one does that anymore, but it was interesting. Here at Tulsa, when we built the North American Living Museum, we had quite a collection of North American songbirds over the years. We bred a number of curve-billed thrashers, which was an interesting thing to do. And then this was our last North American songbird. The summer tanager, I think, was about 16 years old when it died. It had been brought in as a rehab bird, and it was very popular. For the time being, we're without North American songbirds at Tulsa. This is just interesting that meantime, the Germans, or Berlin Zoo, after their birdhouse was demolished in 1943, they built the zoo in West Berlin rebuilt their birdhouse, but on the other side of the Berlin Wall, the East Germans decided they couldn't let the West Germans have a big zoo with them not having one. So the folks in East Berlin built an enormous zoo with an enormous birdhouse, and now with the wall down, Berlin has two zoos, both with enormous collections of birds. And at what used to be East Berlin, I saw this tropical kingbird, which is found in Texas. So it's a North American native species. They probably got theirs from South America, but definitely the last thing I expected to see in East Berlin. But in the meantime, North American zoos and aquariums have continued to keep North American songbirds. One of the finest exhibits is at Chattanooga, where in 1992 they opened the Tennessee Aquarium. And they've bred quite a lot of eastern bluebirds in this exhibit and sent them to other zoos. I think they were the first place to breed American goldfinches, and they kept some very nice wood warblers in here. I saw a beautiful pine warbler and a white-eyed vireo when I visited the Tennessee Aquarium some years ago. And finally, in conclusion, here's again a picture of the National Zoo's birdhouse, which when they opened it in 1928, they were very proud of, but it was showing its age by by the time the 21st century came along. And it was closed temporarily, but in 2022, the National Zoo's birdhouse is going to reopen. And you can see the original building here with the modern facade at the front, but there's still a lot of the original 1928 birdhouse. The architects did a great job of preserving some of the more decorative features of the old birdhouse. But what they have done now is confined the whole collection in this birdhouse to migratory birds. The entire experience when this building opens next year will be for people to understand United States migratory birds and how important they are and the threats that confront them. So it'll be promoting conservation and an appreciation for birds. So it'll be a totally unique presentation of North American birds. Here's a Chesapeake Bay exhibit. They have aquariums full of horseshoe crabs so people can understand how important horseshoe crabs' eggs are to all the red knots and other migrating North American shorebirds and why it's important to conserve horseshoe crabs. So this is their Chesapeake Bay room. And then they have a prairie pothole exhibit. So you can see red-winged blackbirds flying around and gadwalls on the floor. And again, the prairie potholes are another threatened part of the North American environment. And finally, the biggest exhibit will be a Costa Rican coffee plantation. And along with all the tropical American birds here, a little hard to see, but they're little spots of blue here and there. They have indigo buntings. The National Zoo is already breeding indigo buntings, which will be part of this exhibit. And they're also interested in sending them to other places. So perhaps we may, there's a, you can see an indigo bunting right there. And so perhaps when Tulsa Zoo exhibits North American birds again, it might be indigo buntings hatched in Washington, D.C. Well, that's what I have to say about North American songbirds as aviary birds, and please ask any questions.
Joseph, thank you so much. That was incredibly fascinating and interesting to see the evolution of people and birds together. And I think we've seen some dramatic changes that you've shown us from 150 years ago to now. And I'm sure there are going to be more in the future. A couple of questions for you, if you got a minute.
Yes, absolutely.
Is bird collecting in the wild still a problem in the United States and or worldwide?
Not in the United States, but some of the migratory songbirds are threatened in Mexico. There's still quite a trade in painted buntings and indigo buntings. People still have them in Europe. I had thought the trade had stopped completely, so I was a little surprised to see some of the European people on Facebook showing pictures of their varied buntings and some of the indigenous Mexican buntings. So they're very valuable in Europe. They cost hundreds of dollars and people are breeding them there, but apparently there is still some trade going on in from Mexico to Europe, but not nearly as much as there used to be. And you no longer, as I mentioned, go down to Tijuana or Matamoros or other places and see cages and cages full of indigo and painted buddings sitting on the street for people to buy. So that is, so the Mexican bird trade. But I should mention the zoo in, let's see, Houston. Houston right now has 22 male and 2 female indigo buddings, which were seized at our US border. Apparently, somebody thought they could bring in some of these Mexican trapped indigo buddings and sell them to people in the United States, and they got seized by the feds. So the the Houston Zoo now has these 24 birds, mostly males, which are being held as state's evidence, but eventually they'll probably be distributed to zoos. And between the captive bred indigo buddings that the National Zoo in Washington is breeding and these illegally seized indigo buddings, there might be a US zoo program to work on just one kind of songbird. Indigo buddings would be a good choice since people love seeing them so much and they are so dramatic. I should mention that there has been some work with some of the North American endangered songbirds in collections, especially the Florida grasshopper sparrow. There is a private foundation, White Oak, up on the Florida-Georgia border, which has done very well breeding Florida grasshopper sparrows. And to reintroduce, they were on the edge of extinction in Florida, but the Florida grasshopper sparrow, they figured out how to hand raise them in rear large numbers. So that program is working, and that's taking place at a facility that also breeds Asian elephants. White Oak was just in the news for bringing in a whole bunch of former circus elephants to breed. And they keep very rare African and Asian antelope and other things. And so, but they also are working with Florida grasshopper sparrows.
Interesting. I know I saw a painted bunting in a cage when I was in Cuba.
Yes,
that was
another place. Cuba exported hundreds and hundreds of painted buntings in the 20s to England.
Another question is evolution of the role of zoos in bird conservation. You've shown us some of the early steps and how we've progressed to where we are now. How do you see that evolution continuing in the future?
There will be, there's a much more emphasis on birds that have a conservation priority, but at the same time, almost all the bird, if you look at any given bird in a zoo collection, it is likely to have hatched at some zoo or another. So there are comparatively few wild-caught birds now in American zoos, and the number is falling. It's quite interesting that there are a lot of small tropical passerine birds from Africa and Asia, which consortiums of American zoos, there needs to be a minimum of 15 to make it what they call a species survival program. But you have a rare species of thrush that's found in only 2 islands in Indonesia that is being bred. We'll be getting a couple of those at Tulsa pretty soon. Very popular Chinese songbird, which is managing to exist fairly well despite the fact that there's a huge trade in these Huame laughing thrushes. That's another zoo, American zoo program, and there are various African starlings and so a lot of small insect and seed-eating birds, which 50 years ago, you would pretty much presume had been trapped in Africa or Asia and imported by a dealer and bought by a zoo. Nowadays, just as likely they, if you look at an African starling at Tulsa, you will find it hatched at Lincoln Park Zoo in Chicago or in the Phoenix Zoo in Arizona. And we have sent birds that small birds we've bred at our zoo all over the place. African firefinches are a specialty of ours, and we're getting ready to send 20 that we bred last year to the North Carolina Zoo, and the Bronx Zoo has them. The Brookfield Zoo's in line for some. There's a place in North Carolina of some of our firefinches. So there's a lot more breeding and a lot more programming going on. People meet regularly to discuss who gets what genetically as far as these North American songbirds. Another thing we're doing at Tulsa is taking part in the South American green jay breeding project. You know, of course, we have green jays in Texas, but the ones in Peru have yellow eyes and a different colors. And someone thought they could import a bunch of those into the US from Peru because they didn't realize they were that Fish and Wildlife considers them the same species as our Texas jay. So those green jays ended up getting confiscated, turned over to the Bronx Zoo, which sent some of them to us where we've been breeding them. If you come to Tulsa Zoo now, you'll see in the, we have 4 Peru Inca jays, as we call these South American green jays. We have 4 Inca jays in an aviary in our old 1957 birdhouse, and 2 of them have brown eyes and 2 have yellow eyes. And the brown-eyed ones just hatched about 2 months ago. And if one of them turns out to be a female, it's going to go to the Memphis Zoo. I already got asked for it. So there's this close network now where small birds are worked with in a way that no one would have dreamed of 50 years ago.
I know that
cooperation.
As I've traveled to a number of places around the world to look at birds, one of the big conservation changes that has happened is that the local people who were being paid to catch birds and collect them for people who wanted to sell them have now been enrolled into responsibilities where they are paid to take care of the birds so that ecotourists can come see them.
Yes. Well, quite often those people, because those people knew exactly where to go and trap and catch and how to do it, they're generally the best people in that neighborhood to know where to show them to folks with binoculars, and they have the best idea how to see the birds there and where to find them. So that sounds like a wonderful solution there.
And it really seems like that has been successful not only for birds, but for mammals and other things too. So. Yes. I hope that trend continues as well. In the past, we've seen from your examples, both market hunting and collecting of birds has had a significant impact, along with collecting eggs and those sorts of things too. What do you see now as the human influences that are having the biggest negative impact on birds?
At the present time, I'm mostly seeing improvements. The Chinese are ever so much better about small bird preservation than they had been a few years back. They actually, back at the time in 2000, when the People's Republic of China prohibited the export of cage birds, I had European friends saying, that'll last about 2 years, and but that happened in 2000, and now the only Chinese birds that are being kept in zoos have been bred here. China's not doing that anymore. Indonesia's not doing that anymore. India stopped completely. In South America, there are only 2 countries that have been exporting birds regularly: Peru and Suriname and Guyana. Well, that's actually 3 countries, but and they have a very regulated bird trade. But right now, as far as threats go, there's still this awful problem in the Middle East, around the Mediterranean, and in places like Turkey, in Iraq, and so on, where people still make it a sport each year to shoot migrating songbirds, and they eat things like orioles and thrushes and so on. People have been eating thrushes, things like North American robins and all the species in Europe. They very easily get very fat, and people enjoy eating them. When Hornaday and Madison Grant and other people prohibited the songbird trade back at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries, one of the big targets were people from Italy and Greece and so on who liked eating robins. And that was there was a certain degree of ethnocentrism and racism involved in that, but at the same time, Hornaday and Grant and Osborne and other people were determined to stop folks from eating robins and other thrushes in the United States. In Rome, back in the first aviaries in Rome, back around the time of Julius Caesar, a lot of them started as places to fatten up different kinds of European thrushes like blackbirds and missel thrushes and so on. So they would get very fat and then they would roast them and serve them up in feasts. And however, some people started enjoying hearing the birds sing and decided to keep things like nightingales, which are too small to eat. So there were already, at the time of Julius Caesar, people who had stopped keeping birds to eat in their aviaries and were keeping birds to listen to instead. And that was already kind of a class thing, that if you could afford not to eat your birds or eat the fishes you kept in your fancy fish ponds, that showed you were a person of high class and high standards if you didn't eat your pets.
Yeah. I guess I see habitat loss as something that's just, I don't see an answer to that really as our population continues to grow. But I think there are still things that we can do as people that can have a significant impact. And I know bird collisions with windows and glass and lighting and those kinds of things are things that we can still work on and I think make significant progress on. So there are people working on that here in Oklahoma, and I hope to see some of those things get even more strength and support in the future, things that we can do something about.
Do you know Rick Kotarski at our zoo?
I sure do.
Yes, we're very proud of him. And of course, he's a very valued member of our staff with all of the work he does with monarch butterflies and other local conservation projects. And he also manages our international conservation projects as well. So along with everything Rick does for native Oklahoma environments, he also supervises what we do with a place in Java where they're keeping some severely endangered songbirds that were almost, actually I should say in Indonesia, it's still a major problem right now. People trapping songbirds and keeping the males in cages to the point where there's been a lot of extinction of local populations, and some of the species are just on the edge of extinction. And so there is a place in Java where they captive breed endangered songbirds to keep a reserve going. Some of those have been sent to Europe. That species of thrush from the two islands in Indonesia that we may be getting pretty soon, that's actually by a roundabout way. The American zoos got theirs from the Europeans. And so there's, but so at any rate, Rick is involved in all our international programs as well as our local ones. So I'm not at all surprised you know him well.
Yeah, I've worked on him with several conservation projects, the monarchs and others. So yeah, Rick does a lot of good things. Well, I don't want to hog all the question time here. So anybody else has questions, feel free to ask. If anybody's talking, you're on mute.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and I enjoyed putting this together and sharing it with you all. And if you have any questions later, you feel free to contact me through Jay.
I have a question now. This is Maria. So we do have a couple of bird species like the European starling that's taken hold here in North America. Do you know of any North American birds that did take hold in like Europe or other areas?
No, people tried. There actually were passenger pigeons being released in the 1850s in England, but they got shot out. Carolina parakeets, there was a flock of them in Germany that were all killed by someone whose apples they were eating. And it was quite a big flock that flew around the neighborhood. The American robins that people tried, they flew right out over the Atlantic and were never seen again. Cardinals, interestingly, North American red cardinals, they're all over Hawaii. So that is one place that you can see our North American cardinal all over the place, Hawaii. Hawaii also has meadowlarks and house finches. And I should mention the fact we have house finches from coast to coast. You know, we didn't, before the 1940s, house finches were a Western bird, typical of California. But in World War II, when the German animal dealers and the Japanese bird dealers, who were major sources for America of caged birds, when they, of course, were enemy countries and couldn't sell us any more canaries and finches and things, someone had the bright idea in California of trapping a bunch of house finches, shipping them to New York and selling them in pet stores as Hollywood finches. And then the feds found out about that and raided these New York pet stores. And a lot of folks just turned their house finches loose, which ended up on Long Island, and they started breeding. And so now house finches are found everywhere across North America. They spread from the west, they spread from the east coast, and they met through all the railroads and things. And so now they're found across the whole country. But that wasn't the case before the 1940s. So house finches are just everywhere now, but they weren't before 1940.
Joseph, thank you so much. Enjoyed it immensely.
Yes. Thank you, Joseph.